the Home Archivist, caring for your photo collection. Let me begin by saying that your photos don't have to be in an archive to be deemed worthy of preservation. Everyone's photos are important and deserve to be preserved for future generations to enjoy and learn from. That's what we do here in the archive, and that's what you can do at home. And an important first step in preservation is proper storage. So the first question you may be asking yourself is, where do I start? First, you want to make an overall assessment of your collection to see what you're working with. That means actually handling your photos. Since oils and dirt from your hands can damage photos, it's recommended to wear gloves. So get yourself a box of nitrile gloves. These can be found at any supermarket, pharmacy, or even Staples. Make sure they fit your hands. You don't want them to be too loose because it makes it hard to feel the photo through the gloves, and you might wind up causing damage as a result. Now on to the assessment. What types of photos do you have? Are they mostly 20th century snapshots? Do you have older 19th century photos mounted on board, or even daguerreotypes? How large or small is your collection? Do they all fit into one box, or do you have several albums worth? Also, what is the average size? Do you have more 4x6 prints or Polaroids? Finally, what kind of condition are your photos in? If they are torn, flaking, or moldy, set them aside. I won't be talking about conserving your photos today, but I will touch on how you can store them to prevent further damage. During your assessment is a time to remove photos from magnetic albums. I think almost everyone at some point has had one of these. They have sticky cardboard pages and plastic sheets that are in no way archival. The combination of plastic and cardboard produces acid that not only discolors the pages, which you can see here, but damages the photos as well. Usually, you can peel the photos right off the page because they often lose their stickiness over time. But if you can't, I'll provide an alternative a little later on. Now, make sure you keep your photos in order when removing them from the album, because that will help with the next step, which is to organize your photos. And the best way to do this is by date. You can often figure out the date by looking at the back of the photo. Sometimes it's written there, or newer prints often have a date stamp. If you're removing the photos from an album, they probably were originally added in chronological order. Maybe you can ask relatives to verify the date, which also ties into my next point. And another way is to use context clues, like the type of clothing or the car model you see in the photograph. You may also want to gather and record information at this point in your assessment. If you do figure out the date or discover other information like names or locations, possibly from relatives, you can write on the back of the photo using a soft pencil and light pressure. Or if it's a newer print made of slick paper, you can use an acid-free, photo-safe, light-fast pen. And one brand to look out for is Zig, that's Z-I-G. Or better yet, write or print out on a separate piece of acid-free paper and keep it with the photo. If you have a lot of information associated with the picture, this is often a better alternative than writing on the back of the photo itself. So you assess what you have, you organize your photos, and now you want to know, how do I properly store them? The best way to store a majority of your photos is in plastic sleeves. That's how we do it here in the archive. But I'm not talking about just any plastic. You want to use an inert, stable plastic like polyester, which you may know as mylar, polypropylene, or polyethylene. Never PVC or polyvinyl chloride, because it's unstable and deteriorates quickly, which can lead to damage. Luckily, many archival supply companies have made it easy to find the right sleeves by indicating if products have passed the PAT or photographic activity test. You can see it would look like this. This is an international standard that tests the possibility of chemical interactions between photographs and a given material after prolonged contact. An advantage to using sleeves is that they come in all different sizes to meet your needs. And it's always a good idea to fit the sleeve to your photo. You don't want too much room in the sleeve so that the photo bounces around. And obviously you don't want them to be too tight. Either way, it could damage the photo. Here in the archive, we use Print File brand, which can be purchased directly from their website, archival suppliers, and even Amazon. Now, what do you do with all these sleeves filled with photos? If you want to be able to look through your photos easily and often, the best way is by using 3-ring binders. First of all, they protect your photos. Secondly, the combination of sleeves and binders means there's no need to introduce adhesives, which you would have to ensure are archival and photo safe. So what should you be looking for in a binder? Ideally, the board should be made of acid-free, lignin-free materials. Now, when I say lignin-free, I mean it doesn't contain a substance that causes paper and board to yellow and discolor over time. Think of old newspapers, how they become yellow and brittle. That's the lignin coming out. So if it's lignin-free, it won't do that to your photos. You'll know a product is really safe if it says it passed the PAT or photographic activity test, as I mentioned earlier. Since binders stored on edge can warp over time, and I can attest to this because it's something that actually happened in the archive, you'll want to store them horizontally unless you purchase a matching slipcase, which I'll warn you can get expensive, or you can use something called a binder in box, and I'll show you an example of that later on. An alternative to binders is using folders and boxes. It's not as easy to view your photos when you use this storage method, but it can also be less expensive than buying binders or albums. Again, you want to look for acid-free, lignin-free boxes and folders, which can be purchased through archival supply companies. You can add photos directly to the folders without sleeves, but if any are fragile or have a sticky back because you removed them from an album, it's a good idea to interleave them with acid-free paper so they're not touching the other photos. You can still use sleeves like you see here because they keep the photos neat and organized. And when you do want to look at them, it's easier to handle the sleeve rather than the photos themselves. If you're using a document box, that's what you see here, and it's full, the box can be stored upright. But if there's a lot of room in the box, you can use acid-free cardboard spacers or balled up acid-free tissue paper, or better yet, just lay the box on its side. You can also use flat boxes instead. Now, plastic sleeves are great to use, except when they're not. And I'm going to show you some examples of when it's better not to use sleeves. If you have a photo that's fragile, torn, deteriorating, flaking, or moldy, it's better to put it in a folder. Just carefully sandwich it between 2 pieces of acid-free paper and then keep it in a box. Now, this is a way to prevent further damage to your photo. I don't recommend trying to fix it yourself. If you would like to conserve it, consult with a professional, like someone from the Conservation Center for Art and Artifacts in Philadelphia. That's who we use. What if you have photos that can't be removed from an album? If they don't come off the page easily, don't force it. Instead, remove the page from the album if possible. And in the case of magnetic photo albums, you can usually remove the pages from the spiral binding. And protect the page of photos with a piece of acid-free paper. It would be best to remove the plastic sheet as well. If that won't come off easily, you can carefully cut it out. Then place the album page, protected by the paper, into a folder and then into an appropriately sized box. Sometimes print file plastic sleeves don't come in the size you need, or your photo is oddly shaped or too thick for a sleeve. Or maybe you have an album like this one that should really be kept intact. In that case, it's best to store these photos or albums in a flat box, and you can interleave with acid-free paper or tissue. What about cased photos? If you're lucky enough to have daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, or tintypes, you'll want to wrap them individually in acid-free tissue and store them in a box. If you know any information about the photograph, like names or dates, you can write it in pencil on a piece of paper and wrap it up with the tissue. You'll be able to see through the tissue and easily identify your photos without having to unwrap them each time. Now that you've assessed your collection and determined how you're going to store it, you need to actually purchase some supplies. There are a good number of archival suppliers out there, and I'm actually going to show you these few in a minute. And you don't have to remember their website address, just Google their names or the words archival supplies or something to that effect, and they'll come up in the search. We also have an archives and preservation brochure on our website, and the link will be shared in the chat, which lists not only these sites, but a few more, along with other helpful preservation resources and information. And it's not just for photos, but for preservation in general. I also want to note that this whole process can get expensive, so figure out how much you want to spend and make sure you shop around. And you don't have to do this all at once. You can prioritize which photos you feel need the most attention and go from there. You may want to get other family members to go in on buying some of these supplies with you. It could make them feel a part of a family archive. Now, before we go online, I just want to remind you of some keywords you should be looking out for when you go shopping. It's not enough for something to be described as archival. You should look out for acid-free materials, of course, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that term. But acid-free can come in buffered and unbuffered. Buffered means it's been treated with a chemical which neutralizes acids. If you see this word, it's fine to use with almost all photographs. Unbuffered means it hasn't been treated with the chemical, and it should be used with only very specific types of photographs, like something called cyanotypes or dye transfer prints. And it's not likely that you'll have these, so I wouldn't worry about it. Just go with the unbuffered or unbuffered. Tissue paper also comes in buffered or unbuffered. And in the case of photographs, it really doesn't matter which one you use. Lignin-free is also important to look for. That's what I was talking about this earlier. It's a substance that causes paper and board to yellow and discolor over time. So you definitely don't want anything with lignin coming in contact with your photos. And of course, look for the 3 types of acceptable plastic. It's often easy to spot if the archival supplier mentions that a product passed the PAT or photographic activity test. Okay, so now let's go shopping. We're going to start with print file archival storage. They have a photo pages tab. And as you can see, they have all different types of sleeves. I'll just go into this one. And they have all different types of sleeves for all different types of size photos, quantities, and price points. They also sell other archival supplies, as you can see up here. And as I mentioned earlier, print file is sold on other archival supplier sites and on places like Amazon. Another website I would recommend is Archival Methods. They have the three-ring binders I was talking about before, and also something called a binder and box. This has the 3 rings, but the box it makes it easier to stack your albums horizontally. Gaylord Archival is another website you can go to. They have, under the preservation tab, they have all different types of supplies like boxes, folders, sleeves, and dedicated photo preservation supplies. University Products has a photo products tab where you can find album pages and archival storage boxes. And most of these websites have the other supplies you may need, like acid-free paper and tissue, folders, and other types of albums. Just remember to look for those keywords I mentioned when choosing products. So now that you have your photos organized, sleeved, in binders or boxes, where do you store them? Your family photos are precious, but you don't have to go to this extreme to store them. That being said, try to find a clean, dry, dark, relatively cool place in your house, like a closet or a spot in an interior room. Basically, somewhere your photos won't be exposed to high heat or humidity or those kind of fluctuations. So definitely not basements, attics, or garages. I would like to end by sharing a picture of part of our photograph collection here in the archive. You can see that we use document boxes that are filled with folders and sleeve photos. And on the top shelf are some of our larger flat boxes that store our oversized images. And I realize that we can maintain a climate controlled environment and we do have a budget for supplies. But the same principles that I have shared today apply to this archive and to the family archive you can create at home. I'd like to thank you for joining me for today's program. I hope you found it informative.